chapter 7, verses 24 to 37. It says, Jesus left that place. He had been in a place around Galilee arguing with some Pharisees, which happened a lot. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. That was over on the coast. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And then he told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee, so kind of like back home, and into the region of the Decapolis. There, some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, and his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He's done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Again, this is the word of the Lord. In the 2010 movie, The King's Speech, which I'm sure many of you have seen, it's one of my favorites. It's about King George VI finding his voice. King George is the one who reluctantly assumed the throne of England after his brother reluctantly abdicated. But because of a severe speech impediment, George VI enlisted the help of an Australian speech therapist named Lionel Logue, who helped the king learn to speak well to his people during a time of national crisis. And the movie artfully showed that finding the king's voice was not just a matter of technique, but it was very much a matter of the heart. Because the king's job wasn't just giving speeches, it was speaking to the needs and the hopes and the fears of his people. Finding your voice is always a matter of the heart and of learning to speak to the needs of others. Which means it's not just the job of kings, but it is the calling of Christians. Christians are called to find our voice as disciples of Jesus Christ. The world is a very noisy place, as you may have noticed, filled with the voices of marketers and politicians and influencers and experts and very opinionated social media commenters. The noise is incessant and intrusive. It even fits in our pockets now on these little devices, and it's always with us. And so the question for us is, how do we speak Christianly into this noise? How do we speak well of Jesus Christ without just adding to the decibel level that's already out there? Because people are listening. People are eager for answers to the things that bother them and challenge them and frighten them. All around us, there is so much insecurity and division and loneliness. It's in hospital rooms and boardrooms. It's in courtrooms and in classrooms. Jesus is needed in those places, which means the Christian voice is needed in those places. But how do we find it? How do we make sure that is the voice with which we are speaking into this noisy world? Well, today's text, which is the lectionary text for this Sunday, I think helps us answer that question. It's kind of a three-part story. Mark puts these three pieces into one story, and together it teaches us how to find our Christian voice. In part one, Jesus calls us to find our voice by speaking up for the voiceless. A woman came to Jesus begging that he would heal her daughter who was possessed by an impure spirit. Mark tells us she was Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia, which means that by the Jewish standards of Jesus and his disciples, she was an unclean outsider with no inherent rights to receive God's mercy. It's a bit of a caricature of the Jewish understanding, but in many ways, that's what a Greek woman like her was up against. The Jews would have said, no, we don't deal with those people. She was an outsider. She came second, didn't have any inherent rights. She was what the Jews called a Gentile. And because she was a Gentile, and should have come second after the Jews who had God's promises and were God's chosen people, that's why Jesus responded the way that he did. It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Now, the Jews in this statement were God's children. The dogs would have referred to the Gentiles. And the Jews, God's children, essentially had first dibs on anything that God had to offer and to provide. And everybody else came second. And Jesus was essentially saying it wouldn't be right to take what is rightfully the Jews and give it to the Gentiles. Now, this sounds really harsh. This is not the Jesus we've come to know and love, right? But Jesus was deliberately exposing the prejudice of his own people. The saying about tossing bread to the dogs would have probably been a familiar trope that the disciples would have heard and maybe even used themselves on occasion. And Jesus used it to essentially test them and show them in an embarrassing way just how cruel it could be. After all, this wasn't really a Greek woman. This was just a desperate mother. And Jesus was essentially showing the disciples, look what this prejudice does in situations like this. Look how it treats people in situations like this. Well, she replied marvelously, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Amazingly, she didn't argue. She didn't even defend herself. She just said, I understand that in your belief system, I come second and I have no rights. That's fine. I'll take what's left over, though, if you don't mind. And for that response, Jesus healed her daughter. The whole point of this story is to show that, yes, the woman is to be commended for speaking up for herself, right? But she shouldn't have had to, is the point. Jesus is essentially telling the disciples we should have been speaking up for her. We need to speak up for her. Jesus calls us to speak up for the voiceless, for people who come second and who, for whatever cultural or societal reason, don't have any inherent rights of their own. Finding our Christian voice means speaking up for non-Christians, for non-citizens, for the unemployed, for the unhoused and undocumented, and for anyone who is defined by the group of people they don't belong to. Finding our Christian voice means speaking up for those people. There's a part of us that wants to protest and say, but it's not right to take what's rightfully ours as Christians, as citizens, as people who have worked hard and made good choices to have what we have, and just give it away to these other people. But Jesus says, oh yes it is. Yes, it is right. It's absolutely right to give away what is rightfully ours. Why? Because there's enough. Because there is plenty. There is enough left over. So much so that we don't have to wait to see if there's any left over. We can just give, we can share, as the verse in Hebrews said. That is the sacrifice we can make. Jesus calls us to speak up for the voiceless in this world. That's part one. Part two, Jesus calls us to speak plainly. After returning home to the Galilee area, some people brought Jesus this man who was deaf and could hardly talk. Jesus healed the man, and Mark says he began to speak plainly. The word here for plainly is orthos, it means right or correct. It's where we get orthopedic and orthodontics and orthodoxy, right? Things that are right or correct. The man spoke correctly, truthfully, plainly. And we are called to do the same. But I think it's worth noting that speaking plainly begins with listening fully. The reason the man could hardly speak was because he couldn't hear. We're told the man was deaf. Speaking plainly requires first listening fully. How often do we put our foot in our mouths because we didn't listen first? When we rush to speak, we speak poorly. James 1:19 says that's why we should be quick to listen and slow to speak. If we want to speak truly, rightly, correctly, plainly, then we must first do a lot of listening. A few years ago, a therapist posted on social media, "As a therapist, I can say confidently that while therapy is helpful, what most people really need is money." I thought, how witty, but also true and to the point. Sometimes an emotional problem is actually just a money problem. Sometimes a guilt problem is actually a sin problem. And sometimes a spiritual problem is actually a mental health problem. I've heard more Christians than I can count over the years look at various mental illness and say, "Oh, none of that stuff is real. That's all just Satan attacking people." Well, not that Satan can't, but there's also not a demon under every rock. You know? And we won't know until we listen. Until we listen fully, and then we can speak plainly, right to the point of what is really going on. We can address people's real needs instead of addressing what we think or assume that they need. This is part of finding our Christian voice as well, learning to listen fully so that we can speak plainly. Part 3. Jesus calls us to speak out. Same story, part of the same healing, but after the man was healed, Jesus told everyone, we're not sure if that's just the friends who brought him or if some of the crowd had come back around at this point, Jesus told them, whoever else was around and witnessed this miracle, not to say anything. This is a common command that Jesus gave. Mark often records this in his gospel. I love this line, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. If that's not human nature in a nutshell. Again, this was common for Jesus to ask for silence after his miracles, but A, it didn't work, and B, that was then. That was back then. During his ministry, there are various guesses at why he did this, but it was probably because Jesus didn't want to get too famous too quickly. Otherwise, he might get in trouble with the authorities before he was finished with his earthly mission. Does that make sense? There's kind of this sense that Jesus is saying, just be quiet a little bit longer. I have a little bit more to do, right? Let's not rush this. But of course, people kept talking about it anyway. But that was then. That was during Jesus' earthly ministry. Jesus now has died on the cross. And when he did, he announced, "It is finished." And then he rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. In other words, the time for silence is over. The time for silence never worked then anyway, but it's also over. Now is not the time. Now Jesus calls us to, like the witnesses, speak out and speak well of Jesus. And it occurs to me in reading this story, that they couldn't help themselves, right? And that's common to these miracle stories. Jesus told them to be quiet. They couldn't help it. They just talked about what Jesus had done. Speaking out about Jesus, what we sometimes call evangelism, comes naturally to us when we are, like the crowd, overwhelmed with amazement at what he has done. It comes naturally when it comes from a place of overwhelming joy in Jesus. That's the true spirit of evangelism. It's one of joy and amazement, not obligation or pressure. Just like the crowds who couldn't keep silent, we can't help but share news that is genuinely good. Think about the last time you had some really good news. Did you keep it to yourself? No is the answer. No, because when it's just great news, we have to share it. We can't help it. That's evangelism. That's how it works. That's part of finding our Christian voice. It means finding the joy in Jesus again. If we've lost it or forgotten it. It means finding what's joyful about it again. What about this news is genuinely good? It means reacquainting ourselves with the miracle of Jesus' salvation. Even if Jesus didn't heal our illness, answer our prayer, or whatever it may be, Jesus has forgiven our sin. And that is no less miraculous than any of the other things we have ever prayed for. When we speak of Jesus to others, it should always come from a place of deep gratitude for his mercy and love. When it does, it's just going to happen automatically. It'll pour out of us. The world needs to hear from Christians about the good news of Jesus Christ. It needs us to speak Christianly into the noise of the world and address the very real needs of very real people. Jesus calls us to speak up for the voiceless by giving of what is rightfully ours. Jesus calls us to speak plainly by first listening fully. And Jesus calls us to speak out about his amazing grace. That is how we find our voice and tell the story of Jesus and his love. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.